If you grew up believing Florida's swamps belonged to two animals, the alligator and the crocodile, you were taught a lie of omission. Somewhere out in the canal south of Miami, wildlife officers have pulled living, breathing Nile crocodiles out of American water. Not zoo escapees, not one-off oddities, a breeding presence, confirmed by DNA, that nobody can fully explain and nobody has been able to fully remove. This is the story of how one of the most dangerous predators on the planet quietly slipped into the United States, why it took over a decade for anyone to admit what was happening, and why the scientists who study it are more worried today than they were the day they found out. Let's start with the animal itself, because the name alone should tell you everything you need to know about why this matters. The Nile crocodile is not a curiosity. Across the African continent, it is responsible for more confirmed human deaths than any other large predator alive today, with estimates running into the hundreds of fatalities every single year. It is bigger than the American alligator, more aggressive than the American crocodile, and unlike both of its native cousins, it has a long, well-documented history of viewing human beings as prey rather than as something to avoid. That is the animal that wildlife biologists in South Florida have now confirmed, through genetic testing, has been living and reproducing in the canals around Miami-Dade County. So how does something like that end up in a Florida drainage ditch? The honest answer is the same answer behind most of Florida's invasive species problems, the exotic pet trade. South Florida has functioned for decades as one of the largest unregulated import and breeding hubs for exotic reptiles in the country. Permits were loosely enforced, private collections were rarely inspected, and the animal that outgrows its owner's expectations has always had an easy, anonymous exit into the wetlands. Burmese pythons got there this way. Tigers, iguanas, and a long list of other species got there this way. Investigators believe Nile crocodiles arrived the same way, likely from a private breeding operation or exotic animal collection sometime in the late 1990s, when a small number of animals were either released deliberately or escaped during a storm. For years, nobody noticed, or more precisely, nobody wanted to notice, because Florida already had a monster story consuming all of its attention. Picture South Florida in the mid-2000s. The python crisis had exploded into the global news cycle. Researchers were photographed beside snakes longer than cars, with deer-sized bulges in their midsections. The headlines wrote themselves, the funding followed the headlines, and an entire generation of wildlife biologists, journalists, and state agencies organized their attention around a single, very visible, very photogenic threat. When you train an entire field to expect one kind of monster, anything else that shows up gets quietly folded into the explanation everyone already believes. A strange sighting in a canal gets logged as a misidentified python or an oversized gator. Nobody is lying. Nobody is covering anything up. It is simply how institutional attention works. The python ate the headlines, and in the noise, something else was learning to hide. The first hard evidence came in 2009, when a juvenile crocodile was caught almost incidentally during a routine survey of the Miami Canal system. On paper, it should have been unremarkable. South Florida is full of crocodiles, but the biologists who handled the animal noticed something was off almost immediately. The bony plates running down its back, called osteoderms, were arranged in a tighter, more uniform pattern than anything typical of the Native American crocodile, whose armor tends to look more irregular and loosely spaced. More unsettling than the appearance was the temperament. A native crocodile, when captured, generally goes still, conserving its energy rather than fighting a battle it can't win. This juvenile did the opposite. It fought continuously, aggressively, and let out a low guttural vocalization that the handling team had never heard from an animal that size. They photographed it, tagged it, documented the anomalies, and the file went into a drawer. More captures followed in 2012 and 2014, and this time the pattern was impossible to dismiss as one strange individual. The animals pulled from the canals were growing at rates that didn't match anything in the local data. Biologists estimated growth roughly a quarter faster than native crocodiles living in the same water, eating the same prey, basking in the same sun. In a closed ecosystem, that kind of growth advantage isn't a curiosity. It's a competitive weapon. A faster-growing predator reaches breeding maturity sooner, outcompetes neighbors for food and territory, and physically overpowers rivals before they are fully grown. That detail lines up with something researchers tracking the Native American crocodile population had been quietly noting for years: a slow, unexplained disappearance of established, dominant adults from territories they had defended for decades. These weren't sick or aging animals. They were the strongest individuals in the population, abandoning prime real estate they had no obvious reason to leave. In predator ecology, that kind of displacement almost always points to one thing: something bigger and more dominant moved in, and the established king quietly stepped aside rather than fight a battle it would lose. In May of 2016, the question was finally answered with certainty. Genetic testing on a stretch of mitochondrial DNA from one of the captured animals came back as a complete match to Crocodylus niloticus, the Nile crocodile, with markers tracing to a specific southern African population. This wasn't a fluke, a hybrid, or mutation caused by warm water near a power plant, a theory some had floated earlier. It was the real thing, alive and reproducing in American wetlands. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Every animal captured and tested was a juvenile or subadult. The genetics confirmed these animals were related to one another, siblings, which means they had parents. Nile crocodiles take roughly 10 to 12 years to reach sexual maturity. For the offspring captured between 2009 and 2014 to exist at all, a breeding pair had to have arrived in Florida, survived undetected, and successfully reproduced sometime around the late 1990s or early 2000s. Those original animals, the founders of whatever population now exists in the canal system, have never been captured, never confirmed dead, and never officially accounted for. What does that mean practically? It means wildlife managers are not dealing with a single escaped pet. They are potentially managing the descendants of a breeding population that has had close to 2 decades to establish itself, adapt to local conditions, and disperse through a canal network that spans hundreds of miles and connects directly to some of the most heavily used recreational waterways in South Florida. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what is and isn't established, because this is exactly the kind of story that tends to get exaggerated past what the evidence supports. Confirmed Nile crocodile captures in Florida are real, documented, peer-reviewed scientific finding, not an urban legend. What is not confirmed is some kind of large, thriving, expanding megapopulation poised to take over the state. The number of verified individuals captured remains small. Researchers do not have evidence of an uncontrolled population explosion the way they do with Burmese pythons. What they do have is enough evidence of successful, multi-generational breeding to take the threat seriously, and enough uncertainty about how many animals are still out there to make eradication a genuine, ongoing challenge rather than a solved problem. So why does this matter so much more than just another invasive species story? Because of what separates the Nile crocodile from everything else competing for space in that swamp. The American alligator, for all its power, is not generally inclined to view humans as prey, and confirmed fatal attacks, while they happen, remain comparatively rare given how many alligators share space with people across the southeastern United States. The American crocodile is shy almost to the point of being reclusive. In the entire recorded history of the species in the U.S., there has never been a confirmed human fatality attributed to it. The Nile crocodile breaks that pattern entirely. It is a documented, repeat, opportunistic predator of humans across its native range, responsible for more verified human deaths annually than lions, leopards, and hippos combined in some regional comparisons. It does not have the cultural or biological hesitation that has kept Florida's 2 native reptiles largely out of serious conflict with people. Layer onto that the climate question. Florida's 2 native crocodilians have spent millions of years adapting specifically to the temperature swings of the peninsula, the alligator tolerating cold snaps that would kill a crocodile, the American crocodile sticking to the warmer coastal fringes where it can survive. Nile crocodiles are not naturally cold tolerant in the same way, which is one of the reasons some researchers initially assumed any population would be self-limiting, confined to warm refuges and unlikely to spread far north. But if interbreeding between Nile and American crocodiles has occurred or does occur in the future, and the 2 species are, troublingly, genetically close enough that hybridization is not biologically out of the question, there's a real concern among biologists about hybrid vigor producing offspring that combine Nile aggression with greater cold tolerance, potentially pushing a population's viable range further north than either parent species could manage alone. To be clear, this hybridization scenario is a precautionary concern raised by researchers, not a documented outcome. Nobody has confirmed Nile American crocodile hybrids in the wild, but it's exactly the kind of low probability, high consequence scenario that keeps wildlife agencies from simply shrugging this off. This is also why the python comparison, while useful for explaining how the crocodiles went unnoticed for so long, actually undersells the seriousness of the situation. Pythons are ecologically devastating. They have gutted small and mid-sized mammal populations across the Everglades, but they are not generally considered a direct, credible threat to adult humans. A breeding population of an apex predator with a genuine track record of killing people is a categorically different kind of risk, even if the current confirmed population is small. So what is actually being done about it? Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, along with university researchers, has continued targeted trapping and genetic monitoring in the canal systems where these animals have tamed up, particularly around the Miami-Dade area near sites like Takey Point. Reporting protocols have been tightened so that unusual crocodilian sightings, animals with the wrong skin pattern, the wrong temperament, the wrong behavior for a native species, get flagged for genetic testing rather than dismissed as misidentified alligators. It's a far more proactive posture than existed in the 2000s, when the python crisis absorbed nearly all available attention and resources. But South Florida's wetlands cover an area vast enough to make total eradication of any small, dispersed population an enormously difficult task, as the ongoing, decades-long python removal effort has demonstrated. Catching every individual animal in hundreds of miles of canal, marsh, and mangrove is not realistic with current technology and funding. Realistically, what wildlife managers are aiming for is containment and suppression, keeping the population from establishing a self-sustaining foothold large enough to expand, rather than a guaranteed, complete removal. For the people who live, fish, and boat in these areas, the practical takeaway isn't panic. Confirmed Nile crocodile encounters remain extremely rare, and the vast majority of crocodilian sightings in South Florida are still, overwhelmingly, ordinary American alligators or American crocodiles behaving exactly as expected. But it is a reminder of something a lot of people forget. The Everglades is not a static, fully catalogued wilderness. It is a sprawling, constantly shifting ecosystem that has already absorbed pythons, tigers, iguanas, walking catfish, and now, apparently, one of Africa's deadliest predators, all because of decisions made decades ago in the exotic pet trade, the consequences of which are still unfolding in real time. The deeper lesson here isn't really about crocodiles at all. It's about how slowly and quietly an invasive species crisis can build before anyone with the authority to respond actually sees it. The python invasion took years to be taken seriously because the scale, once visible, was undeniable. You cannot hide a 15-foot snake with a deer in its stomach. The Nile crocodile story unfolded almost in the opposite direction. A handful of animals, captured years apart, each one dismissed or filed away individually, only adding up to a coherent and alarming picture once someone finally ran the DNA and looked at the pattern as a whole. It's a case study in how cognitive bias operates even among trained experts. When an entire field has been primed to expect one explanation, contradictory evidence doesn't get ignored maliciously. It just gets quietly absorbed into the existing story until the data finally forces a reckoning. So where does that leave things today? Wildlife agencies continue monitoring known capture zones. Genetic testing has become a standard part of processing unusual crocodilian captures in South Florida. And the question that opened this story remains genuinely unanswered. The original founding animals, the pair, or pairs, whose offspring have been pulled from the canals over the past decade and a half, have never been confirmed captured or confirmed dead. They may have died naturally years ago. They may still be out there, in a wetland large enough to swallow an aircraft without a trace, continuing to do what apex predators do best, surviving, undetected, in a swamp built to hide exactly this kind of secret. What do you think happened to them? Are they still out there somewhere in that sawgrass, watching the boats go by? Let me know in the comments.